Hello everyone, greetings from Bristol in the UK. I'm really sorry I couldn't be with you. My name is Jeremy and I'm British, and I have had a commitment and a loyalty to Iboga for at least 20 years now. I was initiated into Bwiti and Ibando 10 years ago, more or less, and since that time I have helped to open an Iboga clinic in Portugal with my buddy Alvaro, and I'm also a director of the Global Iboga Therapy Alliance with my friends Claire and Toby, and I have worked on various matters to do with Iboga medicalization, Iboga protection, and so on and so forth. So right now I want to talk about feeling quite apprehensive about the state of Iboga at the moment, for two reasons. Firstly, the prevailing model for Iboga provision is what I think to take to be a factory model. Drive-through Iboga, if you like, 100+ patients a month with minimal pre-treatment and a thank you, goodbye at the end of 3 or 4 days in a clinic, which I think is a disgraceful approach. And then secondly, the other thing that makes me nervous right now is the advocacy. The loudest voices in the advocacy for Iboga medicalization, from my perspective, are suffering from ego inflation, and there's an element of hubris, pride coming before a fall. So I think it's a really important time. It's really good that there's better knowledge of Iboga and Iboga, but it's complicated, right? And I imagine many of the people listening to this now would be nodding in agreement. So what to do? Not to fully block what's going on or resist, but at the same time not to just go along with it and think that it's the best that we can do. So in that context, I think the most important thing is asking the question about what reciprocity might consist of and how there can be equal partners, folks from Gabon and folks from the West. And how do we negotiate an inevitable power dynamic between those with money and influence and access to media and all the rest of it in the West, and people in Gabon, some of whom may have something of a voice globally already, but others in Gabon who themselves have been marginalized in their own country and don't have a voice even in Gabon, whether that's forest dwellers or women in various Iboga movements in Gabon and so on and so forth. So two things about me that I didn't say already. One is that I studied philosophy to a PhD, and I think that'll be relevant in what I'm just about to say. And secondly, my day job is I work as a consultant in the mining sector. And as you may know, we need mining more than ever right now because we don't get the energy transition and a move towards a more decarbonized world without mining. It's simply a fact of life that the energy transition and a move to green technologies requires copper, cobalt, manganese, graphite. So my job is to try to push for responsible, ethical, sustainable, if you can have that word in mining, practices which are of benefit to communities. And I've spent a lot of time in my day job thinking about how communities engage with powerful players who come in and dig holes in their land. So going back to my background in philosophy, one thought I had preparing for this is maybe I should talk about rawls. That's R-A-W-L-S. And some of you may have heard of this American philosopher, and he had a really interesting thought experiment that's stayed with me since finishing my studies many years ago. And he's imagining how agreements can be made in society across different interest groups and different types of people to come up with a theory of justice or a principle of justice. And he has this idea that, well, one thing we could do is have a cloak of invisibility. So all the people making decisions or policy making, they don't know what class group or what interest group they belong to. There's a cloak of invisibility about their own backgrounds. And so you go into a planning or decision making or policy making process simply being ignorant, a veil of ignorance he calls it, in fact, being ignorant about who you yourself are and what your interests might be. And he thinks that that might be the best way for justice to be developed and embedded within a society. Now, I think I like that, because just in the context of Iboga, just imagine if we could have a veil of ignorance around interest groups within Gabon and between Gabon and the West. Or at least in a more practical sense, you were not allowed to, it would be a conflict of interest if you brought your own interest biases into the conversation. So that would be a more practical, realistic version of how you could apply the veil of ignorance in a real life setting. But of course, the problem with that is that even if you don't know what your interests are going into the conversation, you're still bringing your cognitive, cultural, social biases, many of which may be conscious and many of which may be subconscious or unconscious. So if you have a Western mindset, you might come from the perspective that this is a new tool for medicalization, and it's simply a molecule that we need to study and maybe replicate and synthesize and create in the lab so that we obviate any issues with Iboga and Gabon. Or you may come from a perspective of really disagreeing with private healthcare, as in the US, and you may have a public healthcare model, say the UK, where I'm from. You may have any number of perspectives on Ibogaine or Iboga medicalization that you, even if you don't know your own interest group in the veil of ignorance, you still bring to the table. So it's in the context of Gabon and Iboga, what do we do? Well, going back to my mining sector background, I think the thing that has gone wrong with the mining sector for many, many decades and has caused many tragedies and traumas upon the land and in the souls of people is that the power dynamic between those with money who come and maybe ease their way in legally through ethical or unethical means and shut out of the conversation are affected communities. Well, I think there's a widespread recognition that that model is not sustainable. And many people in my day job are pushing for a much more just approach to how you engage with directly affected communities. But the thing that is still going wrong in the mining sector, and I think is a learning for what we're talking about today, is trust and accountability. And so, details aside, what we need to bring into a dialogue that's both national within Gabon, national to Gabon, but also international, is, in a way, literally and metaphorically, carefully selecting the people who are in positions of representation of their interest groups. And everyone is sitting on the floor. No one is sitting on a throne or a plush seat. And there's a fair, balanced representation of all the interest groups. And the rule is that we must all look each other in the eye, and we must all hold each other in trust, but also accountable. And if there's this horizontal accountability principle, and if the ethos is that we must all form deep relations with each other across time, even if we come from completely different interest perspectives, or even if we don't share the same values or ways of looking at the world, if we all agree going into the process that trust and relation and relationality is the most sacred thing about what we're doing, I think that will provide guardrails against unethical practice or unjust practice. Of course, things can still and are likely to still go wrong. and power imbalances within Gabon, and also power imbalances between Gabon and the West, are still likely to be replicated, and that's just life. But if we all coming into the dialogue hold trust in high esteem and hold accountability in high esteem, and we allow for all the different voices and interest groups to be fairly represented, then at least we've got something. And I think the final thought I'll have is that what does benefit sharing and reciprocity ultimately boil down to if you go through a process that's as enlightened as the one I'm suggesting? Well, it might occur from a Western perspective that this is ultimately about money and making sure that there's a royalty from Iboga treatment in America that inevitably goes to Gabon, whether or not the source of the Iboga is from Iboga from Gabon or not. Gabon should be recognized as the sovereign host nation that brought this global cultural healing gift to the world and should always be forevermore recognized in that way. Well, from a mining sector perspective, that could be, the road to hell being paved with good intentions, because throwing money at a problem to salve guilt, or consider that that is the way in which reciprocity should be addressed and implemented, can have all kinds of unintended consequences. Money itself can create a gradient of power where one didn't exist in the past, and then it creates its own forms of corruption and unethical practice and positioning. So we have to be very careful to move slowly and think slowly about what the dividends of benefit sharing may actually look like. If you take another perspective and you say, well, okay, if it's not money that we're sharing from some kind of royalty, is it some kind of intellectual property that we share together, which has yet to be fully appreciated, I think, in the advocacy conversation in America and in the West. Maybe, but then there's another problem, because ultimately the gift of Iboga healing through Bwiti and other means is a form of indigenous knowledge system. And any approach which tries to appropriate or share in that indigenous knowledge system is at risk of being considered cultural appropriation. So that's a very careful, slow, sensitive dialogue that needs to take place. You might think that Iboga or Ibogaine simply cannot be accommodated into the Western medical model, and that's a fair point. But then in response to that, do you introduce a more Bwiti-oriented approach? You could do, but you have to be very, very sensitive in what you're doing. On the one hand, people in Gabon who've held up Bwiti and developed it as this complex of different spiritual healing practices, they are just humans like the rest of us. There is no special relationship to the divine among the people of Gabon, much as I recognize and respect Gabon for the powerhouse, spiritual powerhouse that it is. We are all just human in relationship to a divine that we don't fully understand. But on the other hand, we need to recognize that Gabon has held this secret, the forest people in particular, for centuries. But there are many people in Gabon that want to share the gift to the outside world. So I think ultimately it comes down to the people in Gabon sharing the gift on their own terms, in the context of trust and in the context of horizontal accountability. Okay, so I think that's pretty much all I have to say. I really hope you're having a wonderful time. I really wish I was there. Circumstances have got in the way for me being there. Much love to you all. Basse.